Great. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. Our next panel is Flows and the Big Shift in Business Models. And I'm Ivy Estabrooke, and I'm happy to introduce our panelists, John Hagel and Paul Sallomi. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. So to start us off, Paul can you give us some context on the current situation in data, a little bit of the historical context of how flows have worked in the business enterprise?
Sure, and there's been a lot of discussions that have touched on this over the last couple of days, very enlightening. I think what we're going to talk about here is just some of the ways that the flows that are now enabled by technology create a real transformative opportunity for the business models that we see in the corporate environment. And it's really a fascinating topic because if you just sit back, excuse me, and think about it, flows have always been. They've always been the great enabler of commerce. Whether you're talking about the natural flows of nature, the ocean currents, the winds, waterways, to man-made flows like the Transcontinental Railroad or the airlines or the internet. They've always been foundational. And when they're first created, the plethora of opportunities or the vast landscape of opportunities that they create don't really come directly to mind. It takes time. It takes the development of tools to really commercialize, to really figure out how to take advantage. And what's really different now and what's really fascinating now is that with the falling cost of computing power, the falling cost of data storage, the ubiquity of bandwidth, the rise of mobility and globalization, we're at an unprecedented moment where the opportunity to create new flows is bigger than it's ever been. And everyone's trying to figure out what that means, how that can change the world, and how it can change commerce. And so we're here to share a few thoughts on some emerging business models that we're seeing.
Great. And I don't know if everybody else picked up this wonderful paper that's on the Deloitte table. I would encourage you to grab a copy and take a look. But you articulate an interesting model of how these changes in data availability are going to change the business enterprise. Can you walk us through some of those points, please?
Yeah, sure. So I think at one level, as Paul said, the technology that's becoming available now is making the invisible visible at scale and in real time. And so the flows of data that are now generated from this technology do create an opportunity to rethink at a fundamental level the business models. Unfortunately, as Paul said, I think that the tendency in the early days is to just use this technology to do what we've always done faster and cheaper, versus stepping back and saying, what are some different business models that could be enabled by this flow of real-time data at scale? And so we've ended up looking at 3 different dimensions of business models that we believe will evolve rapidly. And by the way, I'll also say that based on the research we've done at the Center for the Edge, current business models are fundamentally broken. One of the key analytics that we've done is looking at return on assets for all public companies in the US from 1965 until today. Return on assets for all public companies in the US has basically collapsed over that time period. It's declined by 75%. It's been a long, sustained erosion, no sign of leveling off, certainly no sign of turning around. So if you want a measure of the brokenness of our current business models, we think that's a pretty good indicator. So the good news is new business models are enabled and available. And one of the dimensions has to do with payment in the business model. Oversimplification, but a lot of our conventional businesses, current businesses, you pay upfront for a product or service. And then it's up to you whether or not you use it and how you use it. Increasingly, because of the data flows that are now available, you can shift that upfront payment to a usage-based payment, where you only pay for how much you use of the product or service, because the data flows allow the vendor to track usage and charge you based on usage patterns. And that can be very disruptive. There's an even further level of evolution on that dimension of payment, which is paying for impact or paying for value. Rather than just paying for usage, if you get no value from that usage, who cares? What if you paid based on the actual value that you are generating from that product or service? That's a much more interesting form of payment, very different kind of business model.
So along that continuum, and we're not suggesting that the better, faster, cheaper elements of technology are not critically important. In fact, they certainly are. And we see a lot of examples of that. We talked over the last couple of days about predictive maintenance. There's also entire smart factory assemblies, global distribution systems. There are a lot of ways where better, faster, cheaper is critically important to operations. But we're talking about here is something even push the envelope further, something more transformative. So think about this idea that almost anything, and it was touched on in the concept of GE and jet engines, that's a common example, but there are a lot of examples all the way down to certain emerging models around print as a service or laptops as a service. But think about almost anything that was once transactional and a product that might be followed by a maintenance contract, having the opportunity today to be converted to more of a service that could be better applied in the marketplace where people were able to pay for use, or even further through technology where that product can be constantly monitored and fine-tuned to deliver an enhanced amount of value to the end user, where what they really pay for is an output. That's the end game in the payment world that we see as possible, and we see some emerging models around that.
So there's another dimension of evolution of business models, which is around data itself. Typically, again, oversimplifying, but in traditional business models, you may generate some data as a result of selling a product or service to a customer, but typically you use that data for your own operations to enhance the efficiency of your own operations. What about taking that data and making it available to the customer in ways that create value for the customer? So one simple option is use the data to help be more descriptive for the customer about the context they're in, help them to better understand the context they're in. That in itself has some value. There's an opportunity to take it to another level, which is to use the data to be more predictive with the customer, to help the customer anticipate what's likely to happen as they use the product or service. And that's even more value. But there's a third level of value, which is being prescriptive with the data. Not just help the customer to anticipate what might happen with the product or service or their usage patterns, but help to advise them, recommend to them courses of action they can take given what's likely to happen in the future. I'll just give a quick example of a potential evolution that I think is an interesting one. It's in the insurance business, using these kinds of data flows. Today, insurance, again, oversimplification, is basically risk compensation. We all know there's risk in life. We're going to compensate you when that risk occurs, if it occurs. That's the insurance model today. What about evolving to an insurance model which is around risk minimization? Rather than just compensating you for the risk when and if it occurs, help you to minimize your risk. That's even more value. And there's a third level of value for an insurance provider, which is actually reward maximization. The reason we incur risk is because we're trying to do things to achieve something. What if, based on the data flows, insurance companies could help the user actually maximize the reward and minimize the risk, and of course compensate if risk actually occurs? That's a much more powerful model in the insurance industry.
I think that's a very great illustration. There's also this other dimension which we're seeing where data can provide the body of information that can allow actions even beyond prescriptive, but actions to be taken where problems are solved even without human intervention. And one really early and simple example of that, because it's a very contained system, is anti-lock brake systems, and they've been around for a long time. But now we see the emergence of without human interaction, just braking happening, right? Because there's much more input that is required for that. And we talk a lot about autonomous vehicles, but if you think about the universe of applications where data can even move beyond prescriptive and move to specific corrective actions that benefit users and actually liberate time for humans to be thinking about other things. It's a fascinating landscape that's unfolding for us.
Absolutely.
And then, should I go to the third?
Please go. Keep going. You're on a roll.
So there's even a third dimension of business model evolution, which has to do with participation. And what we mean by that is, if you think again, most business models today, participation is the vendor and the customer, two parties. I mean, the ideal of most business people today is that one-to-one relationship, just you and me, and that's it. Increasingly, as a result of all these data flows that are now available, there's an opportunity to create platforms to connect the customer with a whole range of additional third parties that could add value to that customer around the product or service that you might be offering to them. So that significantly increases the value to the customer by expanding the range of participation. And then there's an even further level, again enabled by all these data flows, which is, do you really need a platform at all to connect the customer with anyone, anywhere, who has the potential value that they could provide to that customer? I mean, think about Google at one level with their search engine. They're connecting you with whatever information is available anywhere in the world. And their platform, I guess, is the internet. But it's not their platform. It's a platform that's already out there. It's the digital infrastructure that's providing that opportunity to connect with anyone, anywhere, to add value to that customer relationship. So that's a big opportunity as well.
And we see this across a lot of different dimensions. And one example is, really early is just think about your smartphone as a platform. And when that was opened up to the developer community, what did we get? We got millions of applications. Some of them more impactful than others, but having that kind of an open talent network has really changed the game. And we see that emerging in commercial arenas as well, with things like GE's Predix or IBM's Bluemix and open platforms for Watson. We're starting to see enterprises angle towards that epiphany that they don't have a monopoly on creative talent, right? And the universe of what is possible with the tools that are being built is only going to be realized when we start to work in a network environment and when we start to open up the opportunity to have those really creative entrepreneurs have access to tools. And when you start to weave all of these things together, you get this effect of the network effect.
Just that one other quick addition around this notion of connecting customers with a broader and broader range of participants. It creates an interesting third path to growth. I'm struck the number of companies that I deal with today who are under extreme growth pressure, and they're focused on what's our growth strategy. And the challenge is when you get into that discussion in those companies, growth strategy tends to fall back to two options, right? Make or buy. Those are the two ways you drive growth. You either grow organically or you go out and do an acquisition to acquire growth. What about a third path to growth, which is not on the table today, but again, enabled by these kinds of data flows that we've been talking about, which is leveraged growth. And by leveraged growth, I don't mean adding debt to the balance sheet. I mean driving growth by creating more and more value for customers by connecting them with third parties and collecting some of the value for yourself of those expanded relationships. That's a really interesting path to growth. Requires much lower investment, can be achieved much more quickly than the traditional paths of organic growth or acquisition.
So I think you'd both be happy to take questions if folks want to go to the microphones. I think one of the questions this discussion brings for me is, why aren't we seeing more change, more disruption in how businesses work? Clearly, the availability of data is making it easier for individuals to start companies or to start ideas, kind of leveling the playing field, lower barriers to entry, but we're not seeing disruption in how businesses are formed or the big enterprises. Where are the holdups in this transition?
Yeah. Well, in the context of larger enterprises, I think we do see some. Mm-hmm. The question is, why is it that the tools are moving at an exponential rate, and we don't see the transformation happening at a similar pace? And I think it really comes down to the human element. Mm-hmm. I think we've reached the point where the pace of exponential development in technologies is not going to be the inhibitor to how fast our world changes or how fast our business environments change. It really comes down to we as humans are a little more linear in our thinking, and it takes us time to understand, to think about the possibilities, and to formulate our views on what appropriate actions might be. And then when you take individuals and you put them into groups, and you have to collaborate and make choices, it becomes even more difficult. And the larger the institution, the more complex the institution, the more entrenched it is in the status quo. And then when you layer in with the larger enterprises, you also have investor relations, obligations to the street. You have to find a way to deliver the here and now, as well as think about transformation. And I think the same principles apply in a regulatory body. Mm-hmm. I thought the film last night was fascinating. I mean, you could think about the U.S. judicial system as a regulatory body, and we got a real clear taste of how difficult it is to achieve fundamental transformation when new ideas emerge. So it all comes down to me to an environment that helps us understand why we see so much disruption on the edge and emerging small, more nimble enterprises that can fundamentally scale rapidly and transform entire sectors because they're not as encumbered. And there are some great examples. They've been mentioned over the last couple of days for large enterprises in particular, where we're seeing transformation. And in every case, whether it's a regulatory body or a large enterprise, the common ingredient is bold, fearless, innovative leadership. And that's not that common. It's really tough.
I would just add, I think that I agree completely that this is ultimately about human beings, not about technology. I started my career, most of my career has been as a business strategist, but over time I've ended up becoming more and more interested in human psychology because I think at the end of the day, that's what drives successful business strategies. And one of the challenges that we face is, as I mentioned, that ROA trend over decades is an indicator of mounting performance pressure. And one of the problems with mounting performance pressure is human beings, we all have a natural reaction to that kind of pressure. One is we tend to maximize our perception of risk, minimize our perception of reward. And as we maximize perception of risk, we tend to shrink our time horizons. If there's so much risk out there, all I can do is focus on today. Don't bother me with the future, it's just too far out. And as you move to this model of shrinking time horizons, you also tend to fall into what economists call a zero-sum view of the world. If it's all about today, the resources that are available are given. There are no more. There's a fixed amount of resources today. The only question on the table is who's going to get those resources? Is it going to be me or is it going to be you? And when you start to fall into that kind of mindset, trust tends to erode. You may seem like a really nice person, but at the end of the day, I know only one of us is going to get those resources, and it's going to be me, and I can't trust you. So in that kind of environment, adopting the kind of transformational approaches that are going to be required to really create and capture value from this technology become more and more difficult.
It looks like we have a question.
One of the things that's been in the news that relates to both risk and leveraged business models, Uber and Airbnb, are the risks associated with the customer experience when the leveraged resource is somehow not behaving appropriately. So can you talk a bit about how the companies deal with that? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, I think I do. You know, and it is difficult to mention. I mean, I could think of an awful lot of press releases over the years where employees behaved badly as well. So even where executives behave badly. And I kind of have come to the conclusion that as long as there have been or will be banks, there will be Willie Suttons. And how do we govern or control that? It's an extraordinary challenge. I wish I had a beautiful answer, but over the course of my career, I've helped a lot of companies work through issues that were created by internal problems, where in theory they control the population. So this is, you know, clearly the same level of vetting and discipline in terms of a network would need to be deployed that would be employed within a rigor or discipline process in a controlled environment of a corporation, but I don't think that's enough. I don't think that's enough. There are a lot of things that technology can do, and I'm getting out of my area here, but there are a lot of things that technology can do to start to leverage and sense behaviors to start to predict those that are more inclined to behave in bad ways. And I think there's some emerging ways in which security-based professionals are looking at those types of matters. And I think we have a long way to go on that. But the cold hard truth is we'll never eliminate scoundrels and bad behavior, but we probably can use the tools that we have today to be better about detecting and avoiding, and almost ties into that model of being able to catch the bad guys before the bad behavior happens. And there's an opportunity to do that, but that is not a simple problem.
Well, I'll also say that one of the keys to this is platform design. If you're talking about getting more and more third parties engaged with your customers, it's what kind of platform will reduce the risk of that kind of bad behavior. So part of it has to do with your criteria for admission to the platform, who can be qualified to even participate on the platform. But then also reputation mechanisms become a very powerful way to generate additional flows of information, much richer flows of information about who the participants are, how they've performed in the past on many different dimensions. So you can be much more focused in terms of connecting with the participants that are going to create the most value given your particular context.
That undeniable underlying truth that flows underline everything.
No?
As does human behavior.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sir?
Yes, I wanted to go on with the idea of connecting customers to third parties. I would say the most important third party in some ways, and a party which is seldom connected to and is a very positive one, is the environment and the animals in the environment and the plants in the environment. In other words, there are loads of wonderful stories about things which have improved the bottom line of companies by getting just something about the environment involved. The best one I know is Pacific Life, an insurance company that was something like number 33 when it decided to use humpback whales as an image on their checks, and they multiplied by 17 times in a very short period of time.
Wow.
There's a famous story about a panda that was sold on 2 locations in a store, one with the World Wildlife Fund. You'll be a member of the World Wildlife Fund if you buy this, and those outsold the others 2 to 1. It's things like Ray Anderson becoming the biggest floor covering company in the world by deciding that he was going to emphasize the future by trying to get a completely sustainable process for including it. I think there is a passion that beats in the hearts of people that is absolutely underestimated every time, and that if it's possible to go forward with your grand idea of connecting your customers with a third party, I think this would be a bonanza.
No, I think it's a great point. It creates much more visibility along a whole range of dimensions that could be very important to customers and will over time be more important to customers around things like sustainability, to create visibility throughout the entire supply chain, to show that at each point in that supply network, the participants have adhered to certain sustainability criteria or other kinds of values that are important to the customer becomes central. I also just want to add there's an interesting new business model that we've become particularly focused on that has to do, if you take those 3 dimensions that I talked about and go to the extreme of each of those dimensions. So a model where you're charging for value received, where your data is being used for prescriptive purposes with customers, so you're helping to advise the customer, and where you're helping to connect the customer with anyone, anywhere. That's a really interesting business model. We call it the trusted advisor. And we've had trusted advisors for millennia, wealth managers, for example, but it's only been available to the very wealthy. Mm-hmm. Because it took so much time and effort to get to know that customer that unless they had a lot of money to spend, it wasn't worth the effort. One of the really interesting things with the data flows that are now being generated from these new generations of technology is that there's an opportunity to take that trusted advisor business model and take it to the mass market, make it available to a very large portion of the population where your proposition to the customer is, I know you better than anyone else, and you can trust me to connect you with whatever resources, wherever, that are going to be most valuable to you. Yeah. And I will be proactive in doing that. I won't just wait for you to ask me to find something. I'll say, by the way, you haven't asked about this, but based on who you are, what your aspirations are, your context, you really ought to be thinking about connecting to this resource. Yeah. That's a really interesting proposition.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think I love that statement. You know, sustainability is a very powerful force, and you tie back to the film last night, and you heard all the arguments about a corporation being a person, or a ship being a person, or a river being a person, or partnerships being a person, and how do you infuse a sense of conscience and responsibility into an entity that is designated as a person? And that all comes back to the human element again. What's interesting that we see arising is that there's an incredible war for talent. And yes, corporations are driven by profits, but they need talent. And people want to be associated with something that they truly feel good about because it's their life's work in many cases. And so you see this rise of the importance of, regardless of what the motive was, you see, because of the human element, this rise of a consciousness and a sense of accountability and responsibility for sustainability. And I think that's just going to continue with the rise of the new generations because there's much more awareness.
So we're running short on time. Do you have a quick question?
It's quick because I'll say I'm standing here listening to the answer you just gave to the previous question, and it changed what I was going to say as a question into more of, I just want to hear more of that. Because I'm actually, not to make it personal, but I'm in the middle of exactly this topic with my business, where ultimately business is a one-to-one relationship between, and it's a flow. Business doesn't typically like complexity, looks for a simplest solution to that flow, but flows are inherently complex. And it doesn't go up with a linear value, it's probably logarithmic. So if you have multiple customers around a single service, which is what I'm grappling with, you have more than just that same number of flows to deal with. And what I was going to specifically ask you to riff on is the situations in which, how do you find that balance between, sure, a single platform with multiple customers, but in the traditional business models, those customers wanted to have connections to themselves, but they weren't the best way of communicating the power of the business model you're trying to advance. Only by going through the trusted advisor. Like I said, you answered a lot of the question already, but so I would say just continue with that. How do you get from the simplicity of a single one-to-one business model, which is what businesses want, and integrate the value of the flow which is what I'm trying to achieve, so that I can achieve a sustainable investment model, which is actually what we're trying to drive.
No, it's a great question. I think
20 seconds.
20 seconds to answer the question. I would say that that's where I think both the power of the technology is to handle a lot of that complexity and surface a lot of the patterns that are emerging out of those data flows that help you to target value to customers. And I think there is a human element that's involved. The creativity, imagination, curiosity that we humans have can be augmented by the analytics and the technology, but the combination of human beings as trusted advisors and data flows at scale is, I think, a really powerful business model.
Great. And we are now over time. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.